Steven Crowder.
Well, you know his score would be pretty low. All right, so we have a bunch of questions that was emailed in from Midnight Mark Senior. We did one last week, so we thought we'd ask another this week.
We should call him All Day Mark.
All day Mark from Columbus, Indiana. So he asks in another one of these questions, which we are having a hard time picking because a lot of them are pretty good. How have so many people in churches misunderstood the role of a pastor? I think what he's talking about is in many denominations or many churches that are organized, they call their preacher pastor, and they don't really call their elders that. That's the name pastor is designated to the person who's up in the pulpit. Whereas a lot of non-denominational churches, or specifically like one he attends, the Church of Christ, calls their elders pastor, and they don't really refer to them as that at all. And so, I guess the spirit of that is are those churches just all wrong, and they shouldn't call a preacher a pastor based on what we have on the scriptures, or is it really not that big of a deal? And I'll let Piano Man go first because I know he's thought about it a little bit more because we talked about it a little off air.
I don't know if that actually means I've thought about it more, but I guess there's a higher chance, maybe a higher probability. So, first of all, in the Bible, it does refer to the pastor as a shepherd or an elder. And it gives like all these qualities that an elder has to be or a pastor has to be. And then if you look at it from this worldly perspective, I don't know what the right word is, but from this other perspective, the pastor, when it's related to a preacher, the preachers don't have to like have a wife. They don't have to have all these qualities. Like none of those churches would say, oh, our pastor has to have these qualities that it says in the Bible. So obviously there's some like discrepancy between that. But at the same time, if the pastor just means shepherd and they're just saying, oh, he's a shepherd of our like flock of people, then obviously the preacher is the one who's speaking the most often. I could see how someone would say, this is just our shepherd, but just in a different way. They're not saying like this is our elder or our, hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say here.
Yes, I do.
So I guess it's maybe just like a lexiconical thing. I don't know.
So you really got to start with Paul. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, I don't think it matters. I mean, ultimately, I just don't think I don't think it actually matters. I mean, I think if you look, because as Piano Man just said, like if you're looking at your preacher and you're calling him pastor, and then you're like, yeah, so he meets all these requirements. Now that could become certainly a confusing situation for someone, maybe. But I don't think it really matters. Like if you ever meet someone, and if you met a total stranger and they told you they were a pastor, you would assume they were a preacher, right? Like first, you wouldn't be like, oh, you're an elder at your local congregation. You would be like, oh, you're a preacher, and then they might say, yeah, I go to this Church of Christ, and you might kind of change your thought on that, right? Which is interesting. But I don't think that at the end of the day it matters. It's a term that for whatever reason along the way has been adopted for the person speaking. And also, to be fair, in some respects, I think if that's the way you're going to use pastor, and one would assume that if you are leading the church, you are also a capable speaker in some capacity. To lead your congregation, or more so than your congregation, people outside of your congregation, because that's kind of the idea of a shepherd anyway. Is that not only are you taking care of your flock, but if another sheep comes along, you're going to take care of it too. But I don't think I think it's probably one of those goofy things that sometimes being within the Church of Christ, we make larger deals about them we should, right? Like, Jonah definitely did not get swallowed by a whale. It was a big fish. Just one of those things that we make a huge deal about.
How do you know it
That
wasn't a whale?
That's his point.
Oh,
That's
his
what I'm
point.
saying.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, I think it's
Well,
one of those things that at the end of the day doesn't matter, and I understand why the actual language for some people bothers them. But like, I don't think anyone's sitting there going like, "Oh man, you said that the preacher is a pastor, your church is condemned to hell." Like,
yeah. And I
you know,
do. I agree with you. With Paul lays that out in Titus, right? But a lot of what we get in sort of the inference, as it were, to that is actually from Peter. In 1 Peter 5, it says, "So I exhort you, elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you." And then he goes into, more of what sort of you should do there, and then talks about, and he's specifically talking about elders, like actual elders leading the church, because then later in verse 5 he talks about younger people subjecting to the older members of the congregation. And so I don't think it's a big deal that we, or some churches, make a big deal about it, because there should be a distinction among what you do. If you're shepherding a church, but I think where the confusion has come is so many people, and we do it, listen, we do it at our congregations as well. We put more emphasis on the preacher than we do the elders. Many times. Think about a preacher leaves a church. They gets a different job, decides to not be a preacher anymore, or maybe he's not cutting it and they decide to move on from him.
could be many reasons they leave.
Many, right. Those are just kind of the three big ones, right? But,
diddling little kitties.
what? Pedophilia. But but people hold that in high regard, right? Like, there are people who leave churches because the preacher that comes in isn't as good as the last one.
Mm-hmm.
Are there people that come to churches that because a good preacher comes in, that's way better than what they have or better than the last one? I hate to say it, but there's probably less people that actually decide what, when you go to a church, I feel like the thing you look for is, are there people here that I can relate to? And who's up there in the pulpit? Very rarely do people say, "Oh, how is this actually being run?" Who are these men that run it? I'm not saying everybody, but I do think that's sort of what gets in our mind. And I think about that a lot because I've changed churches a lot with my job since I've moved a lot. So I kind of think it is important to make a distinction, actually. I don't think it's a big deal. Like, we shouldn't be like, "Oh, you're a Baptist pastor, you're condemned to hell because you call yourself a pastor." I agree with that. But I do think that if you're in a church who believes that you shouldn't call your preacher a pastor because they don't meet the requirements, you should continue to do that, because we should make these distinctions, because Peter made these distinctions and so did Paul. So I do think there should be.
Do you think, well, maybe this is discussion for another time, but like, maybe part of the confusion here is like, should we even have preachers? Like local preachers that preach every single week? Should we even have that?
Well, I don't think it's a bad thing. But
I'm not saying it's
I will
wrong, but
I will say this, that I think we need to be careful about, because I've heard a sermon when I was in Bowling Green, Kentucky, about how the word awesome is used in this one way in the Bible, and so therefore we should not use the word awesome in like any other context. And so I don't think that's a correct interpretation of how you should use the Bible. And so, like, if someone wants to just say the word pastor to mean shepherd, but not in the sense of like elder that we would use it, then I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So we need to be careful, like, that context, even if it's been developed over time, there's nothing actually there's nothing inherently wrong with it if the context is changed over time.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was saying. I was more or less saying if you're aware of it and you're within a congregation, it's probably good to make distinctions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
I do understand your point. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything bad about making a distinction either.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I guess. Well, never mind. We'll come back to that another day.
All right. I definitely want to get into that topic. All right. Well, we're making good time here, so we'll finish with our what we've been calling a rapid fire, but honestly, I kind of take it as here's some things that were coming off the top of my head, and I just want to know what you think about them because I'm normally stupider than you two, so we'll just roll with that.